You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. All right, welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your filler host, Abraham.
And I'm like your other host, Shane.
Nice. And we're Psychology Podcast. We are actually bringing to you a new format we're going to start doing, which is that we're going to include some nostalgia episodes. We've been doing this for 5 years. And we thought it'd be kind of fun to rerun some past episodes with little updates, to sort of say, this is what we talked about back then. We're not going to do all of them, but we're going to pick out some sort of gems that we liked, that we wanted to revisit for whatever reason. And today we are talking about the filler words in our speech. Like,
things of that nature.
To what? Yeah.
So just to kind of give some background on the format, we decided to do this because just like in any sort of like research realm, like if you're looking at articles and whatnot, you are essentially looking at what's current within the last 5 years. Well, since we've been doing this for 5 years, these original episodes, they're now more like seminal articles, right? They're like there and they're good, but they are no longer updated. So we want to update it with current information because science changes. Science doesn't have a finish line. And as a result of that, we want to make sure that we're providing the most current information possible. So that was kind of where this stemmed from.
Yes, we're going to play the original episode in its entirety, and then we're going to, at the end of the episode, include a follow-up discussion where we talk about some of the recent things that have happened and also some of the feedback that we got from the original episode that had some information that we didn't include the first time around.
Yeah.
So this was originally published on September 27th, 2017. You can imagine the time so long ago.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's been about almost exactly 5 years since this episode came out. So hopefully if you'd listen to it then, this is a fun revisit and you'll now get to remember some things that we have all forgotten. And if not, and you're hearing it for the first time, then great. You get to enjoy. And by the way, this is with one of our previous former hosts, Ryan. And so this is a discussion between the two of us. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. All right. So, hey, everyone, this is Abraham, and I'll be your host today.
And this is Ryan O, and welcome. All right. So if you can tell, something a little bit different this week.
Yeah. So I am. That's funny. Well, I'm gonna have to leave that in there, I guess.
Yep.
So Miranda and I are two of the people that are often doing a lot of the editing of these episodes, and when we're doing the editing, it really came to my attention how often I was choosing to edit out when we say and like when it's decontextualized and things like that, and realized that this was something that might actually be really interesting to talk about. And one of the things I was thinking about is, why do I feel the need to get rid of these uhs, likes, and stuff like that? And then also on top of that, why do we do those awful sounds? How often does it really occur? Which I can tell you from someone who edits these, it's quite a bit. And do other people even notice it when we do it? And so in the interest of these questions and the purpose of this episode, and not because I'm lazy, because I thought it would actually be kind of fun and challenging to force us to confront this, is I'm not going to edit out these uhs, ums, and likes during this episode. So I hope that doesn't drive you crazy for those of you who listen to it. And probably you'll catch it more now than you would have if I hadn't said anything. I'll still do the regular cuts where we cough and make noises that don't need to be there. So this should be fun, and I'm excited to talk about it. And I've already really modified how I approach talking about these things to try and reduce it, partially because I hate editing them out because they take so long, and also because I want to create a good listening experience for you, and that's part of the reason that I edit them out. So let's get into this, Ryan.
All right, so we're going to start with what are these like things when we actually talk about it in like lay terms, right? Like, what are they?
Yeah, so, I've heard some people talk about them as these like vocal or verbal flotsam or garbage. Just these vocal garbage, I guess, is how people put it.
I think that's a little harsh. I mean, I've always,
That's fair.
I've always thought of them as just filler words.
Yeah, and that's actually how most people in the research talk about it, is just these fillers. They're mostly fillers, and what that means is they don't actually contribute to the meaning of what you're saying, and they don't even necessarily have a functional purpose in your communication, although they do, and we'll get to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, some people argue that they do.
Yeah, and I think that they make a good point, and we'll talk about what those are, but they talk about these in terms of they're just like fluff. Oh, I did it right there. It's fluff that just it exists, and it sits in between the meaningful things that we have to say.
So the next question why does it actually matter? And I've seen a few different reasons. One that I've been hit with a lot. I've done a lot of public speaking. I'm not that great at it. I'm getting better at it. There it is.
Yeah.
Is that it's signs of and I'll use these in quotes, like weak or disfluent, like not fluent and, kind of polished speaker.
And it might even suggest to some that you are not confident in what you're saying, or you're not really sure what you're saying. Actually, in movies, a lot of the time, they'll depict someone who is a character who's lying about something, or they want to convey to you that they're lying. They'll say and they'll stutter a lot. They'll say, "Oh, I was doing this thing, and so you immediately, as an audience member, are picking up on they must not be telling the truth, or they don't really know what they're talking about because they're just using all these filler words."
Yeah, and then the other reason it matters is I'm going to notice those a lot.
Right.
I don't go through the editing process, so this is like me going through the editing process in the moment for all the listeners. So typically we're told like to remove it from your vocabulary, especially in the speaking realm.
Right. People, especially if you're going to be on video or on TV or something, and you'll notice in movies, they're really good about not having these fillers in a lot of what they say. And sometimes they will, but when they do, they often do it very intentionally. And so they really are just focused on the get rid of it, get it out of your vocabulary, reduce the number of instances and that sort of thing. Yeah,
which we'll talk about a little bit later. Just reducing something on its own is kind of difficult. You need to have some sort of filler, usually. A filler for a filler word.
Yeah. So in a lot of times when we're talking about these behavior interventions, behaviorists like to recommend that you don't just take away behavior, but you replace it with something that's more appropriate or better or works better for someone or what have you. And that it's missing the part of you're still going to want to use those filler words. So what do you do instead?
Cool. So there's a couple things here. I want to get into the history, and could we track that down, as well as like how often, what are some data and stats around this sort of thing?
Okay, so we're traveling back in time.
So yeah, we're going to travel back in time.
DeLorean. And you're familiar with what's that movie, Back to the Future, right?
I've watched Back to the Future. I just don't know these things.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, we're getting back in a DeLorean, and you're just going to figure it out on the ride.
I do not. I'm not in the movie world. Sorry. A lot of pop culture. With that said, I do read some pop culture stuff when it comes to psychology.
Well, that's good.
So I've got some of that.
Helps here at least.
So yeah, I was digging around, and I found a few different dates out there. The one that I actually liked after combing through a few different places was an article from mentalfloss.com, which sounds interesting. And,
yeah. I like to floss my mental.
But what they did is they basically looked at the Oxford English Dictionary, and they looked at things that were similar to these likes, as and ums, and speech hesitations like hum go back as far as 1469 in the dictionary.
Okay, according to this Mental Floss article?
Yes.
Okay.
And we also find hem as was from 1526, ha from 1679, and from 1862.
So to hem and ha and as a speaking sound?
Yeah, and the progression of these I did not track down, but when it came to filler words that have been marked in the dictionary, these are some points in which we can kind of talk about these. They do acknowledge, and I would, as anything that I've read, there's always other usages before, especially when it comes to like the criteria for them to become something that gets in the Oxford English Dictionary. That takes years and years and years.
Right. Well, and something interesting I found also when I was looking up is these ums and these aren't even really words, but there are actually a lot of words that people use as filler, which are kind of funny often, such as actually and honestly I like the one that I read where they were saying, so up until this point, you've been honest, and now you're being honest. So honestly, and then you go into what you were going to say. Or some other ones, and I know that I use, they'll say things like, as a matter of fact, and another one that I say, I don't know, something like that.
One was just a pause.
Yeah.
Straight silence.
That's actually not one of these fillers, and that is one that they recommend to deal with the fillers.
All right, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Sorry.
Okay.
So a couple other stats, and these don't all fall in this, like they don't all agree with each other. That's usually how these worlds work.
Yeah.
So a few stats. People speak 120 to 150 words per minute, or about 2.5 words per second on average, one study said. Now,
about how fast do you think I speak?
I think he speaks really fast. I think he's always, if you're listening to this on 1.5 speed, he's actually just always talking 1.5 speed. Always, if not 2 times speed.
So I'm at 3. So 225 words to 300 words per minute.
I'd be willing to bet. It'd be fun to count.
That would be fun.
Now, these filler words, people apparently use about 1 to 2 filler words per 100 words used on average. And some have actually shown that we use them as often as every 5 seconds. So we're using these filler words. So there's a range. They're all over the place.
Yeah.
The reason we have these variability is not only do different cultures use them differently, but we also use them individually at different rates, and what qualifies as a filler word changes as well, like we talked about.
And so from this, do you know if it was in just regular conversation that people do this, or where were they getting their samples from?
They were looking at regular conversation, but again, it's like these are like your 30,000 level view stats.
Okay.
Like it gives you an idea of how frequent.
Okay.
The fact that they're rooting them in observable things, I mean, they kind of have to with this topic, but I thought it was kind of cool.
No, that's great. I love it. You get some real down in the dirt sort of nitty gritty. This is how often you speak like I don't know, insert whatever insult there. Yeah.
So there's some other interesting things as well. So every language has its own version, it's been claimed. I don't know all these other languages, but
that makes sense.
I did fact check a couple of these. I asked some buddies in France, as well as someone that speaks Korean, to check a couple of these. And so to reference those, the French has, I don't know the sound, I think. Korean, I'm just going to spell these out maybe. Korean, E-U-M. The Finnish, 2 O's with umlauts over the top.
Okay.
The Russians, and even sign languages have a sign for,
really?
Yes.
I'm just imagining your hands just sort of moving around in the air like a wheel. They're just turning.
Yeah.
That's great.
And I don't know if this is specific to American Sign Language or not. So I worked in a situation where I worked with 4 or 5 different interpreters, and they actually did use those Us in there. Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's kind of cool.
So I think that highlights, at least on one point, that these are kind of functional things, because it's similar across different languages. It's not just inherent to the language itself, but in the process of communicating with other people, this is something that we do that has a sort of a purpose, although it might not be a great purpose, and it might not really serve our overall goals. It does actually serve a little bit of a purpose. We'll get to in a moment. I keep wanting to get to that. It's one of the best parts.
Almost there. So some other overarching research is people have found that age, gender are 2 big factors as well.
Okay. So
could be factors.
Okay. What did they find there? Because I found some conflicting stuff on this. I want to see what you found.
I did. Yeah. That's why I said could. So there was a researcher in 2005 that looked at a lot. So his name was Lieberman. He parsed apparently 14,000 transcribed phone conversations.
Okay.
There was over 12,000 speakers.
Does he work for the NSA?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it, right? He was definitely based in the U.S.
Okay.
And it was in 2005, and he looked at the usage of and he found that it increases with age. But at every age, men say it more than women do. Thought that was a little interesting. But I also found some conflicting things that also suggested otherwise.
Yes, so did I. And I saw that there was a difference between use of the word and the word And I don't know why that's an important distinction to make, but what I saw was that men tend to say more and women tend to say more. I saw some other research that said that there was not really a meaningful difference, that although there was a very slight difference, it wasn't statistically significant, so it was probably just noise from the sample that they got. And then I also saw one that said that even though there was a slight difference in how often one gender says it than the other, how people perceive it when they're listening to someone talk, they actually notice no difference across gender or even age in how often it occurs in their speech. Which gets to a point that I was one of the questions I was asking at the beginning was, do people notice when we say like, actually, that sort of thing? Do people catch on to that? And although this research suggested that they do, they don't necessarily catch on to variations in that across speakers, even with respect to things like gender and age and stuff like that, which I think is kind of interesting.
All right. So another area of research or like thing to look at when it comes to these areas where research is kind of all over the place is I like to lock on and see like, how do people's views kind of change over time? One thing that popped out was an ABC article, actually.
ABC, like the
ABC, yeah,
okay.
Like
the company or whatever.
Yeah,
okay.
American Broadcasting Corporation.
That's the one. Yeah. Thank you.
And they focused on the speaker and the listener in these, which I thought was really interesting because that kind of is more in tune with what we'd like to look at when we're talking about psychology. And of course, there's psychology they're looking at, and I'm sure it's been talked about a lot of other places before then.
Well, most people tend to look just at what the speaker's doing, which is interesting and might miss a component of that reciprocation from the other person. So I think that's a cool thing to tie in.
Yeah. So what I was saying is like, I'm sure it's been talked about before then, but the fact that you kind of see it in this pop culture reference is pretty cool.
Yeah, totally.
And that's where I wanted to focus next.
Okay. Do we get to dig into this?
Yes.
Why it works? Yeah.
So this is your time to start digging in.
Okay.
Let's fill in this conversation with some advertisements. All right, and we're back.
So the big question is, why do we do this? Why do we use these filler words? Why do I say and stuff like that? And there's quite a few reasons. And so when I was doing these editing of our episodes, I did a little bit of a survey. But before we get into that, there is the actual research that shows that one of the reasons that people do this is that it has some effect for you as a speaker, where it can signal that, or for the person who's listening and for the speaker, it lets them know that a delay is coming and that it's sort of a signal to say, hey, wait, it avoids, if you're speaking, it avoids there being this long silent pause that can be kind of awkward and maybe feel socially inappropriate. And so it can avoid those gaps in conversation that would otherwise, people get really uncomfortable when they have to just sit in silence. And actually there's some research on that as well. But when you're having a conversation with someone, if someone just stops talking and they were maybe even in the middle of a sentence, they were saying something, then it sounds more comfortable to hear some sound coming out, this or than just silence. And so it helps sort of keep the comfort level of the conversation, the flow and the cadence of that conversation, to just have sounds continue to be present. So that's one reason that we do this, is that it's comfortable. It carries the pace of the conversation forward. Now that gets at this point of whether or not we do that on purpose. And for the most part, I don't think that we really are intentional, and not going to get into what intentions or conscious is at this point. It is coming though, I promise, because that's a really fun topic to handle.
That was a note that I also put in mine. Was like, I'm not getting into this right now.
Right. Yeah, but we don't necessarily think I'm going to say here because I want them to know that I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. No, it's actually a lot more automatic, and it's really built into how we learn to speak in the first place. That when we grow up in these cultures where that is a part of what we do, and even if we don't necessarily, it still allows us to have that same effect in those conversations by having sound continue to be present, and to force you to endure what it's like to not have to hear the and I'm just going to pause for a second and let you listen to dead air.
Awkward?
Very. And maybe you heard some of the sounds of the room, although there isn't much, so hopefully you didn't hear too much. But yeah, just this idea that when there's this weird sort of awkward pause, it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel very good, and we want to maintain that cadence. I've hit that point over the head now.
We just lost half our listeners.
I know, right?
That pause.
Yeah, probably. So this fits inside of this notion of you're avoiding uncomfortableness. That's part of why this works, is you're avoiding the pause. And another thing that happens is you're avoiding losing control of the conversation. And so this is actually, I'm going to go into now the survey of our episodes and what I found and what I discovered. And this is also, I sort of anecdotally was doing this in my other conversations, is that when you when you maintain the sounds, then you maintain the one who's holding the conversation. And if anyone has ever seen the movie Fight Club, I imagine you haven't because you've never seen anything. But in the movie Fight Club, they talk about how, are you really listening or are you just waiting for your turn to talk? And I find that that's a really profound idea that we probably do it a lot and don't necessarily know that we're doing it, or really acknowledge that a lot of times in a conversation, we're just in there waiting, okay, you're talking. When do I get to have my turn now? And in using these ums and uhs, you get to maintain your status as the active speaker in that conversation, not necessarily acknowledging that the other person's just thinking about what they're going to say next. So it kind of means, in a way, don't talk yet. I'm not done. I just need a second to gather my thoughts, or I need to figure out what I'm going to say next.
So I'm excited to get into this because I've mentioned before, I'm not in the editing process.
Right.
So I don't necessarily know what's going on. I just get this clean file that I get to listen to at the end.
Right.
I do a lot of other stuff. I'm not like, but
you listen to it and you're just thinking, wow, we did really good. We didn't say at all. It was there.
Yeah. I'm like, we rocked it.
Yeah. Not my experience. So anyway, that's one reason, is that you get to maintain your control of the conversation. Another one that I found, and one that I got really hung up on, is the word like. And we sound so much like a parody of someone talking when you say it, not us specifically, but when someone says it so much, and especially when they use it out of context. Because the word like can mean either something I prefer, or it can mean a comparison between two things, such as, in an analogy, a bird is like a plane. But when it's used in conversation not in those ways, it sounds, again, just like that sort of word garbage in a way, or filler sounds. And what I really discovered when I was listening, because this is one where like isn't long enough to really serve as I'm holding my place in this conversation. I mean, it can probably to an extent, and maybe it even does a lot of the time. But for us, I found that we use it a lot when we're switching perspectives in who we're talking about when we're telling a story.
So you and I.
Either one of us. So
Okay.
if I was talking about someone else, I might say he was like, and then I say like to say what he said or what he thought or what he did. Like gets to take the place of all of those things with one word.
Yeah. Are you saying like you and I, as Abraham and Rhino, have a tendency to do these sort of things?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And I think other people do as well.
Okay.
But I didn't actually look at what other people do. This is my survey of us, is that I will say like when I'm saying she was like, and then I was like, and then they were like, and is always that past tense verb conjugation, which I'll get into in a second, and then like. And what that does is I say that whenever I'm switching perspectives, even when I talk about something inanimate.
Sounds like it's very useful then, though.
It is it is useful. It allows me to conjugate the verb the same way without having to figure out what's the best verb to fit there. And that's actually kind of a different one, but I showed up when we switch perspectives. Another one, and this is actually what I was talking about, is when it follows verb conjugation, but it's specifically when it's the incorrect verb conjugation, and I'm supposed to have said something different. So the example that I came up with was, if I say he was like, that's a dumb thing to say, the appropriate way to phrase that is, he said that was a dumb thing to say, or even what he said was, that's a dumb thing to say. And was really not the correct be verb to use there. And for those of you who don't know grammar, there's all these be verbs that I'm not going to get into. But anyway, was is not necessarily appropriate unless I add on to that what he said was. But even then, that wouldn't make sense, as what he said was like, that sentence would be a little bit more jarring than just saying he was like. And we're used to talking in that way. And again, it allows us to use fewer conjugations. I can sort of shorthand, throw together a sentence. And
so kind of how it's this point that different patterns, cadence, mannerisms of speech, like all of those are different habits that are adopted by the culture, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I think that I've noticed people on the West Coast tend to use these slightly differently, and even in different towns and even in different families. It gets pretty small, in whatever your little niche community is. And that whatever it is you sort of grow up or you're used to in the culture that you're in, you tend to sort of adopt those habits and those tendencies, and you're going to use them in sort of functionally similar ways to the people you're around. And in this age of expanded communication that we have through social media and all of that, I think is more likely to spread to other parts of the world that are more remote and where we don't necessarily have that same face-to-face contact, but we still have the same approximate level of communication. And for some people, probably even more than they do with their people in sort of their every day-to-day life that are immediately around them. And so, yeah, I guess really what this is coming to is that it is functional. in that it serves a purpose in when you're talking. And it mostly is going to exist inside of where you are at in your culture and your language development. And it's going to get easier probably to do this the more you practice doing it, and more difficult to stop it if it becomes so routine and habitual that that's just part of how you speak, you know? Whew, that was fun. But there's more.
Yeah.
But wait, there's more.
All right, so let's dive into a little bit of the behavioral science view
Yeah.
of why we do what we do when it comes to.
Yes, we threw it in there. I think we missed the last couple, but we're back. All right, so you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things. I'm just going to kind of brainstorm, and we'll knock one off at a time.
Okay.
So why these things occur, there's definitely this like avoidance of awkward social situations that you talked about.
Yeah.
Right? Can we agree on that?
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
And that actually, so that's representative of the behavior concept of negative reinforcement, different from positive reinforcement in that you're avoiding it, you're getting rid of it.
Yeah,
and
think avoidance.
Yeah, avoidance. And that makes you do that thing more because it allows you to avoid that situation.
Yeah. Now, another thing that I don't know the degree to which it necessarily plays, but there's this concept of response rhythm. It's kind of like your cadence and how fast you're going.
Right.
She talked about.
Yeah, maybe rhythm is a better word for it, but cadence was what I meant. The same thing is what you were saying.
Yeah, and that has been studied a little bit.
Okay.
And it's not like the science is in on it, but it seems to be that those things are used when you're not necessarily fluent and when you're trying to kind of keep that rhythm going. So that's a couple things that I looked into, or kind of perspectives that I have on it.
Yeah, and there might even be so there's a negative reinforcement in avoiding social situations, and there might be positive reinforcement in that people have more captivated attention in that they're staying with your pace and you're speaking the whole time. But another question I had, just moving on to another thing I was thinking about, is do people even hear it when we do these things, when we say these ums and these uhs and these likes? And there was that study that I found where what they showed was that a lot of people don't necessarily pick up on whether or not there's a distinction and how often it really occurs. They don't really attend to it that much, but that you do definitely hear it. So the simple question is, do people hear it? Yes. And to that effect, it does depend on how often and how much they hear it. If
it's overly excessive, then I might notice.
Yeah, exactly right. You might tune it out completely, but yeah, if it's happening a lot, that was a stupid thing to say. If it's happening a lot more than normal, you're more likely to hear it. If you are probably in this episode specifically listening for them to occur, you're more likely to hear them because you have that heightened sensitivity to it, and you're more, you're paying attention for that sort of thing. So another time that people might be more likely to notice it is if those ums and uhs also occur with something it really stands out. Like if you're speaking to someone face to face and they're saying and they have really bad breath, then every drawn out thing that they say, you're thinking, it's so bad. Or if they stutter in a particular way, or they maybe pronounce it weird, or there might be other things. Anything that heightens your awareness of the conversation you're having is more likely to make those things stand out.
Yeah, and then the other one would be when you're kind of like rushed, right?
Yeah.
And you run into someone and they're like, hey, I need to tell you real quick. And they just pause that one for a split second. And you're like, come on already.
Yeah. You're on your way out the door and someone stops and they're like, wait, I have to tell you really quick. There was a thing.
Abraham, come on.
Yeah. You're thinking, spit it out. So in those circumstances, you're also more likely to be really sensitive to when those are occurring. But otherwise, it turns out that a lot of times we can just tune them out completely, or at least they go to a very sort of dull hum. And that's also part of being in part of this culture where you're so used to hearing it and it's just part of how people talk that it doesn't play such a meaningful role in terms of how you interpret the meaning of a conversation or a sentence that someone was saying.
So is this like a habit? Does it fall into a habit?
It shares a lot of similarities to a habit.
Okay.
And we specifically talked about how to deal with habits. And one of those things, at least one of those things, specifically applies here.
Episode 7 was habits.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for linking that back. I couldn't remember which episode number it was. Cool. So one of the reasons that they hypothesized the universal they, one of the reasons that some of the scientists hypothesize that this might exist or that it persists maybe, is not just the fact that there's this social awkwardness thing that you're avoiding or that it plays a role in the rhythm, but also that you're not even aware that you're doing it. And this goes immediately into this habit reversal thing we talked about, because what was step 1 of habit reversal?
Awareness.
Yeah, this is just bringing awareness to it. And so one of the things that is recommended from people who are experts in this is to really just get yourself aware of the fact that you're doing it. And
so there's a few different ways you can do that.
Yeah.
So I've had other people count and actually show me that.
Yeah.
I've actually been in a couple presentations where after I presented, someone comes up randomly that I don't know, and they're like, "Hey, here's how often you said and in your presentation." I'm like, "Thank you."
Yeah. I'll often actually do that where I'll at least count. I don't always tell people, but depends on how well I know them. And if I really, I tend to do it more for people I like just because I feel more comfortable talking to them about that sort of thing.
Yeah. You can do it other ways. You can record yourself, whether it's like video or audio, and you can re-listen to yourself and see how those things go.
Yeah.
I have gotten very in touch with this when it comes to video editing because I've been getting into that more myself. So I will quickly create my script so I don't have to go back. I guess I've come in more in touch with it, in tune with it.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't as much on just the pure audio experience like this.
I definitely do.
Yeah. So I need to watch that more.
Even though I still do it. Yeah. So one of the, actually just what you just said, one of the big recommendations is specifically that you listen to yourself talking, and it can be telling a story. It can be in a conversation you're actually having with someone, and you just listen to it, and then you record it, and then you play it back, and you listen for those times when you're using those filler words and things that don't really need to be there.
Yeah, it's a little weird at first, but it's so easy to get over that.
Yeah, you'll get used to it pretty quickly. Actually, it doesn't take very long. And then another one they recommend is next time there's a pause in a conversation where you would normally say just be present to the fact that you're going to say it and let there be a silence. It's okay for there to be a silence. And a lot of people who coach on public speaking and communication say silence can be a really powerful thing. And so use it. Use that opportunity to capitalize on the moment and there be the silence. That's okay. You can have that.
Yeah. So one thing that I've seen, especially like polished speakers, is they actually plan out their pauses on this sort of
Yeah,
things,
that's a great point.
right? Or their fillers. Like they'll actually like say, "I'm going to use a filler here, and I'm not going to here." Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so that gets at the idea of you're not necessarily just getting rid of those things, but you might replace them with something else. And you might choose a filler that you're going to use. I actually noticed that for myself, and probably people who listen to this have noticed also, that I will say, and so, and those are sort of my fillers that have replaced and oh, and they're actual words as opposed to sounds that just come out of my face that aren't words, but they are functionally the same thing.
Yeah, they are a fair replacement. Right?
Yeah.
They do the same thing.
Right. And the final recommendation that I saw was it takes a lot of effort to speak. And although I'm pretty loud, I know my voice is loud on here, I normally speak really quietly. And I think that when I'm speaking quietly, I do this a lot more with the ums and the uhs and the filler words in general. They recommend that you just speak up. You project your voice, because if you're having to do more effort, you're going to spend less effort trying to communicate those nonsense sounds. It would sound ridiculous if you're speaking really loud and communicating and then you go, right in the middle of it. You know what I mean? So that's another one.
Just in case nobody knew what you were talking about.
Yeah, I know. I like the nice tangible examples. There's another podcast I listen to where someone's filler is and things like that. And you know what I mean? And they say it so much, it's really distracting for me to listen to that. And just because I'm really sensitive to it, and because it's very different from the other fillers that I hear.
Yeah.
Mostly they are those more standard ones that I'm used to. And maybe it's because that's where they're from. I don't know, because I know they're not from the West Coast. But
All right, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right, we're back.
Cool. So does that leave us with kind of wrap-ups?
yeah, I think that we actually hit most of what we wanted to talk about. I think this is an awesome subject. Oh, actually, you know what I wanted to bring in really quick, just as something. I was at a conference. It was like a mini regional conference, and maybe a year or two ago. And there was at least one person there who had done this project on public speaking, and they were training people to specifically avoid their ums and uhs. But their only treatment that they were doing with this, I call it treatment, their only training that they were doing at this was bringing awareness to it. And they didn't practice speaking without the ums and uhs. It was just highlighting this is when you do it and then making them watch videos of themselves after they did it. And what actually ended up happening as a result of that is when those people spoke next, they spoke in these halting, sort of broken up patterns that were kind of hard to follow. So people actually rated them as worse speakers after this intervention.
No way.
Yeah, no, I'm totally serious. That because they were more broken up in their speech patterns and they were so focused, hyper focused on avoiding those filler words that they allowed their speech to lapse into something that was almost something you couldn't listen to because it was so jarring in how they communicated it.
Sounds like there's another component that needed to be kind of added in there.
Yeah,
right?
I think they just missed a critical component of teaching them what to do and not just what not to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing to summarize on real quick. If you want to replace it, if you focus just on what not to do, then you're probably not starting at the best place you could. There's always going to be better results if you're focusing on like how to replace it, whether that's like scripting out a little bit more and planning what you're going to say, or going with those awkward or not supposed to be awkward silences, but that feel awkward from your perspective. Right.
Yeah, allow the silence to exist. I think a take-home point that I want to make is just going back to this. There is a reason we do it. It does actually serve a function, and although they are filler words, they have a purpose in our conversation, but that doesn't need to exist. We could replace it with other things. We can also just be more deliberate about how we speak by practicing. So practicing what you're going to say, planning to have those fillers, have alternative fillers to use, and listen to yourself speaking. Simply practicing that very well, and I actually don't know, I would love to see if someone's done some good research on this, but focusing simply on practicing your speaking and listening to it and using that as feedback, and then doing that same speech again might actually generalize to other places where you're going to do some speaking. I'd love to see if there's any good research on that. I didn't find anyone else looking this up, though.
Yeah. No, this would definitely be a fun area to really walk out systemically.
Yeah. Yeah, to get some, so people who want to do some good research on this, or if you have some good research, send it our way. We'd love to check it out.
Okay, so that was our episode on us, ums, and likes. And so there's been some stuff that's happened since then. As I said, we got some feedback from some listeners, notably one Amy Evans, friend of the show, friend of mine, who sent us in several resources. And so there's a couple from what she provided.
She's a friend of mine too. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't sure how well you knew Amy.
I mean, I wouldn't say as close as you, but like we're acquainted.
Okay, lovely person. So she sent us several resources. A couple of those I'm going to cite here and talk about some of the updates. There were things that we didn't include in the original discussion. One of them was she'd sent us this unpublished manuscript. I'm not entirely sure if this was like a thesis or something. It wasn't very long, so I'm thinking it was just a manuscript someone was writing. But anyway, in this study, they had undergrads listen to audio recordings of speech with high or low levels of these sort of filler words, the uhs and ums and that sort of thing. And they were asking them to rate the perceived intelligence of the speaker. And what was interesting is that the presence or lack of those filler words did not in any way seem to affect the listener's perception of the speaker's intelligence, meaning that whether or not they used the ums, they regarded them about the same in terms of whether they felt like they were intelligent speakers. What it did impact was that people, the listeners, felt that the person who was speaking, if they had more of the filler, they said that they perceived them as just feeling a little less prepared, essentially, for that speech, versus if they had fewer of the uhs and ums, then they were viewed as being a little more prepared. So kind of an interesting outcome there.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that too, though? Like, so I have a friend of mine who... she's a speaker. She speaks at a bunch of conferences, and she says she has a lot of ums. Like she's very aware of her ums in her presentations.
Yeah.
But she spends so much more time presenting than I do. Like she spends so much time preparing these presentations than I do. And so it's really interesting because I don't say as many ums as she does in our talks, but she spends way more time like getting prepared and kind of setting up. So
interesting.
It's interesting. That's a perception versus like an actual reality.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an anecdote. I know that's an anecdote, but that is a kind of an interesting thing where I'm like, I'd like to see more on kind of the level of preparedness of somebody who does say a lot of ums.
Yeah.
You know, how much time are they spending preparing?
Very interesting. I always, for reasons that make no sense to me, but whenever I hear words pushed together the way you said, like see moron, and then I imagine the word moron. That's just where I go on those. I'm always looking for like the punny dad humor thing. So things like that jump out at me, I think, even though they're not that funny, but it's what it is.
I'm there with you.
All right, one more article. So she actually sent us quite a few, but one that I'm going to cite in particular was Frondorf and Watson 2011. And what they were looking at was the use of filler words in a recording of the book Alice in Wonderland. So someone was basically reading it and they had strategically placed filler words. And what they found was interesting is that the filler words actually facilitated recall of the story, which is to say that the version of the story that had more filler words, people remembered details from the story better than when there were fewer or no filler words. And it didn't matter where the filler words occurred, because they had like a recording where they occurred at some strategic points and some at other points in the story. Regardless, if there were filler words, the people recalled the story better, which was really interesting. And the authors suggested that the filler words were creating an opportunity to sort of reorient the attention of the listener. So they hear an and they would sort of just check back in, or they would sort of predict what is about to be said. Now, they actually said that it didn't seem to affect where they put the in terms of people predicting what was about to be said.
Sure.
But either way, that it facilitated the recall, which I thought was just an interesting study there.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. Like the the like gives you a pause so that you can kind of be like, what are they saying?
Right.
So I think that makes sense, but it is kind of an interesting study. I'm glad they discovered that. That's cool.
Now, there's some other things that we didn't really mention in this original discussion, which was that there's a lot of other filler phrases that we use that are not these non-speech things. They're actually words that we string together, but we actually don't use them. They're almost like idioms in the way that we don't necessarily use them to communicate what the words say. We instead use them more as fillers. And in some of the linguists' discussions, they describe this as being these discourse markers. And so it's when you, for example, use the word like, which we talked about, but also if you start a sentence with look, or you might embed that word in when you're not actually telling someone to look at anything. You're not looking at anything, right. You just use the word look because it is a word that then it functions as a pause, and it sort of marks where the discourse is going. It gives you a easily understood punctuation in between your phrasing. Some others include when you'll say, there's the one that people say they're not actually asking if they're not checking in with you. They're just as part of the cadence of their speech. Or another one that's very common, you know what I mean? And another one that's related to that is people say, I mean, and then they'll start speaking. And so all of these sort of function similarly. Another one that Shane, I know you use is at the end of the day. Is another common one.
Yep.
And I've heard people say, and all that is another sort of filler that they'll throw in. And again, like these have functional meaning. These are these discourse markers, but they're just kind of examples of that.
Yeah. Another interesting point too to bring up is that these us, likes, these types of quote unquote filler phrases are often regarded as errors or disfluencies and are relevant to communication, which we're finding they're not actually that, like, they're actually kind of an important thing.
Yeah.
Or they can be helpful. Not necessarily that you should actively program a bunch of and likes into your common phrases, but it is something that it's not necessarily irrelevant. Like, it is a powerful tool within our languaging.
Yes, you're exactly right. That historically has been the case, and even still many people just call them disfluencies. But interestingly, and as we already mentioned that study where they found that people had better recall when there was they also found a similar thing when people were learning English in particular, but a language for the first time, is that if there were words that were preceded by they were more likely to recall that word later or be able to orient to what it meant. And this is both for like toddlers who are learning a language for the first time, as well as people who did not speak. Again, these were done with English speakers. So people who did not speak English originally, they spoke another language and they were learning English. They did better when there was some of those filler words preceding in terms of the recall, which again, so this speaks to the fact that these are not pointless, arbitrary things that we say.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of my favorite things in general is looking at other languages and different kind of idiosyncrasies that happen across different languages. I think slang is one of my favorite things. Sure. Because there's just such great slang across the world. But these filler phrases, the us, likes, these types of things exist in other languages too. So in Spanish, it's or em, which I thought was interesting. Yeah. Scandinavian. This is actually interesting because there's multisyllabic here, but the Scandinavian common one is tuata or so I'm trying to imagine someone speaking like tuata, like that's how they fill the speech with that. I thought was really interesting. Yeah, which is like effortful for English language speaking, it feels like. Yeah. In Japanese, there's eto or ano. Right. Function the same exact way. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it's really fascinating. I mean, and there's hundreds of examples because there's languages all over the world, obviously, but we just wanted to kind of highlight that there are these different examples across languages, that it is not like a uniquely English thing. I found some studies that suggested that although when people are learning a language for the first time, they will use a lot of filler words,
That's just sort of during the acquisition. Filler words don't really actually decrease very much when you have increased fluency in a language. So even very fluent speakers and people who are either born speaking that language, well, not born speaking it, but the first language that they learn is whatever language they're speaking, or they pick up that language later. Although in their first acquisition, they might use a few more filler words. For the most part, those filler word frequencies, the rate of use does not actually decrease as they get increasingly fluent with the language.
Right.
And because, again, they are embedded parts of that speech.
Yeah. It's just fascinating. And I mean, and to kind of like to look at that and to kind of maybe expand upon that a little bit, there was a study in 2022 by Lalway et al. That did a study with learners with autism. And what they showed was that they used and less frequently than undiagnosed peers. Mm-hmm. The authors suggest that this may have been indicative of difficulties with planning and speech production, meaning that these terms are more indicative than fluent speech. The idea that somebody who has fluent speech is more likely to use uhs, likes, and rather than somebody who is less fluent.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which is a really interesting finding. Again, sort of speaking to that fluency actually comes with these filler words in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
A couple more interesting studies here, because I know I don't want to drag out this episode too long, but there's a 2020 neuropsych study that I found. I'm not a neuropsychologist, so some of the terms and jargon in here were very difficult to read. But the gist I got from reading through the sort of highlights of this paper and trying to really extrapolate the major take-home points here was that they found that there was increased activity in the brain and different parts when using filler words to describe an image. Basically, they have these people looking at an image and describe like sort of the who, what, when, where, that sort of thing about the image. They were, I think, making it up. But what they suggested was that the use of the filler words that had increased activity in those parts of the brain, what they were actually doing was then helping to engage a more comprehensive network of neurons in their storytelling.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So again, I'm not a neuropsych. I can't speak to the quality of this study necessarily, but it seems like legitimate that they knew what they were talking about. We're using their data appropriately.
Yeah,
so
it sounds like it.
Hopefully that didn't hoodwink me,
Now, the last study that we want to kind of mention too is Kosmala and Morgenstern in 2019. There was a chapter they wrote in fluency and disfluency across languages. And what they found was that they detailed an experiment in which they presented difficult or easy questions and found that people will often begin with a filler regardless of the difficulty of the question. It's kind of like a phrase used to orient that person to the question and to kind of actively pay attention to what they're answering.
Yeah. So if I were to say, what's 3 times 3 times 4 plus 7?
I would say, where's my calculator?
Right. But if I even said, what's your name? They might say,
Shane.
They'll still start with some kind of filler. And so, what they were thinking here is like, maybe this has to do, like people use these fillers when they're less certain, but they're like, nope, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Regardless of how difficult the question is and how certain the answer is, they'll usually use a filler.
Yeah. I've had my name for 36 years and I'll still say before it. To be fair, I'm questioning whether or not my name is Shane because I'll go to places and like I was just at Starbucks and they put Sheen on my drink order. So I just feel like I don't know if my name is actually Shane anymore.
Secretly, you've been Sheen all along.
I'm waiting to find my birth certificate and be like, what is this?
So I think, the major sort of what I was learning in revisiting some of the newest research here is mostly that it seems like what people are coming to as a conclusion, a lot of the research is that actually that filler words are very important and that they serve an important functional role in our language. And that although there is maybe a condition under which if they might be happening at a rate that's so high that it's worth working on building some replacements or ways or different strategies for sort of filling speech or producing fluent speech without sounding like you're using them so many fillers that it's distracting for the listener. But for the most part, the regular use of fillers is not only perceived as being a normal part of fluent speech, but it actually even facilitates learning and listening and recalling what was said. So interesting piece of
more important than people give it credit for.
Yeah, like and that's the thing is like this is actually it's not a disfluency. Not using fillers is a disfluency,
right?
It's not like irrelevant. They actually communicate really important things in your speech when you say whatever it is. It has lots of different functions it might have.
Yeah,
even I think when I stumble through my speech, that's kind of because I have tried to take out some of the uhs and ums and the things that I say, and instead have replaced it with stammering through a sentence and repeating chunks of it, which has got to be much more distracting than me just taking a second to pause and say, So It is what it is, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody does it. I feel like there's a few phrases that I will say, like you mentioned, I say at the end of the day, but I also say I start sentences with so,
Sure.
and that tends to be a thing too. So
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's interrupt for a moment to hear from some ads. All right, let's get back to it. All right, well, back when we recorded this, we were not giving recommendations. So let's end with some recommendations.
Let's do it.
Recommendations.
I am going to recommend a TV show. It's off the air now, but I really enjoyed it. I caught it a little bit after it went off air and then rewatched it recently. And that's a TV show called Schitt's Creek. And it's, I think, 5 seasons long. Very, very funny, well-written show. Really great characters. Very enjoyable. I think most people are going to enjoy this. Now, this is some more adult language, so not necessarily a super child-friendly show. A lot of the humor also is sort of a little higher level, if you will. So, again, not necessarily super accommodating for those of a younger audience. But for most people who are not very young, I think you will really enjoy this show. Have you watched this one?
I have not actually, and everybody keeps telling me that I would really love it.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's on my list. I haven't gotten around to it.
Fair enough.
All right, so my recommendation is to buy your friends books, and that sounds like a very specific space to be in. And this is just a general rule. If you have friends that are artists who are producing content, if they are generating something that is consumable, or support your friends in the endeavors that they do. Because as somebody who has written a book and somebody who has edited books and stuff like that, it is a very daunting process. And a lot of times there is some uncertainty with whether or not people will like the end product or whether people are going to appreciate it. And, you know, there is just something really special about having your friends support you. And so I just would say, go buy your friends' books. I had a few friends that put out some books recently, and I am truly appreciative of them. So I'm going to give you a couple things to check out if you're in behavior analysis.
Okay.
One is the Wisdom Factor by Alice Darnell Latal and Carlos Zuluaga. It's called The Wisdom Factor, Reducing the Control of Bias, Threat, and Fear While Building a Better World. I like that.
Yeah.
There is the ABA Supervision Handbook, the second edition, from Hannah Juergens, Carly Cordova, and Ulema Cruz, which is a really cool assessment tool. Kyra Sellers and Linda LeBlanc have put out some consulting supervisor workbooks and new supervisor workbooks that are really cool.
Wow.
And so there's just a lot of stuff out there that friends of yours, colleagues, whoever it is, support them in what they do, because they really put a lot of effort into it.
Yeah, unlike music today, people who write books have to put a ton of effort into producing their content.
Yeah, we're not a bunch of Lil Xans over here.
Yeah, you don't get to just like press a key on your keyboard and have it just turn out a song for you.
Yeah,
or turn out a book for you, I guess.
Yeah, it's much more work.
Yeah, a lot of effort. So good recommendation. I like that.
Thanks.
All right. If you would like to write in like Amy did and give us more resources on this, or tell us what we got wrong or got right, or tell us how awesome we are, then you may do that thing. Of course, you can join us on Patreon over at patreon.com, leave us a rating and review, and visit our merch store. But I think we'll go ahead and mostly leave it there. Special thanks to the people who make this show possible. We've got Amanda, Brad, Kathleen, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Costia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much. Thank you, of course, to my team, Justin, Selena, Kyle, Allen, and thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
No problem.
Thank you, Ryan, for recording with me back in the day, and thank you, Miranda, for editing this back in the day. And I think that is all that I have for this. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to WWDWWDpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.